The Karelian Isthmus is a strip of land between two bodies of water, Lake Ladoga to the east and the Gulf of Finland to the west, that narrows at its southern end to roughly 50 kilometers of mixed terrain. Birch and pine forest, broken by lakes and marshes, and low granite ridges worn smooth by 10,000 years of glacial passage, the rock grey-pink in the light, the soil thin over the bedrock, the whole landscape shaped by forces that operated on timescales that make human warfare look like a momentary disturbance of the surface. At its widest, the isthmus is perhaps 140 kilometers. At its narrowest, near Viipuri, it could be crossed in a day's walk. This is the ground that defines Finland's relationship with Russia, that has defined it for centuries, because the isthmus is the only approach from the east that does not require an attacker to negotiate either open sea or hundreds of kilometers of forest wilderness. It is the corridor. The armies that have moved through it because there is nowhere else to move that achieves the same strategic result. And the armies that have defended it knowing that losing the corridor means losing the country. In the summer of 1944, the Karelian Isthmus becomes the center of the most intense and consequential fighting Finland has ever experienced. It becomes the place where the question of whether Finland survives as an independent nation is answered, not in diplomatic conferences or in the calculations of great powers, but in the ground itself, in the birch groves and the granite ridges and the fortified positions where Finnish soldiers hold the line against an offensive that Soviet planners have designed to be, and that Soviet resources make, overwhelming by any rational measure. The Soviet offensive that opens on June 9, 1944, is the largest military operation directed against Finland in its history. It is larger than anything the Winter War produced. It is supported by more artillery, more tanks, more aircraft than Finland has ever faced on any front. The Finnish defensive position, when the offensive begins, is stretched and thin and backed by reserves that are inadequate to the scale of what is coming. Every sober assessment of the situation, made by Finnish officers who are not given to either pessimism or self-deception, arrives at the same conclusion. The defensive position cannot hold. Finland will be forced to negotiate, to cede territory, possibly to capitulate. The war that has lasted since June 1941, the continuation war in which Finland sought to recover what the Winter War had taken, is about to end in defeat. It does not end in defeat. What happens on the Karelian Isthmus and in the wilderness of the northern fronts between June and August 1944 is one of the most remarkable defensive achievements in the military history of the Second World War, and one of the least known outside Finland and the academic circles that study the Scandinavian theatre. It is the story of how a nation of fewer than 4 million people, fighting an enemy that is simultaneously prosecuting the largest land war in human history on the Eastern Front, finds within itself the precise combination of tactical skill, institutional flexibility, individual courage, and strategic stubbornness required to survive the moment when survival seems mathematically impossible. It is the story of a front that held when it should not have held, of men who fought when the numbers said they should not be fighting, and of a military institution that had learned, from 4 years of continuous war, exactly what it needed to know to do what no one thought it could do. To understand what happens in the summer of 1944, it is necessary to understand what Finland's military situation has become by that point in the continuation war. Finland entered the continuation war in June 1941 as a co-belligerent of Germany, not an ally in the formal treaty sense, and Finnish political leadership was careful from the beginning to maintain the distinction, insisting that Finland was fighting its own separate war to recover its own territories rather than participating in the German project of continental conquest. The territories in question were those lost in the Moscow Peace Treaty of March 1940, which ended the Winter War. The Karelian Isthmus, including Viipuri, the lands north and northwest of Lake Ladoga, and a corridor of Arctic territory including the Hanko Peninsula. These were lands that Finnish families had lived on for generations, towns that Finnish culture had built, farmland and forest that Finns understood as theirs. The continuation war began as a war of recovery and, for a period in 1941 and 1942, appeared to be succeeding as one. Finnish forces advanced, recaptured the lost territories and then stopped, officially at their pre-Winter War borders, though in some sectors they had advanced beyond them into Soviet territory. From late 1941 onward, the Finnish front was largely static. The two sides held their positions across a line that stretched over 1,000 kilometers from the Gulf of Finland to the Arctic Ocean, and the wars settled into the particular grinding routine of a static front. Patrol activity, artillery exchanges, occasional local offensives, and the continuous attrition of men and equipment that static fronts produce without decisive result. By the spring of 1944, Finland's strategic position has deteriorated significantly. Germany's position on the Eastern Front has been deteriorating since Stalingrad in early 1943, and the trajectory is clear to anyone reading the operational reports without the filter of official optimism. Germany is losing the war, and Finland's co-belligerent relationship with Germany is becoming an increasing liability rather than a source of protection. The Soviet Union, strengthened by the industrial output of factories relocated east of the Urals and by the flow of Allied Lend-Lease materials, is now capable of mounting offensive operations on a scale that dwarfs anything it managed in the Winter War. The Red Army of 1944 is not the Red Army of 1939. It has been through 3 years of the most intense combat in the history of warfare, and has emerged from that experience with an institutional knowledge of combined arms warfare, the coordination of infantry, armor, artillery and air power into integrated offensive operations. That is, by the summer of 1944, genuinely formidable. The army that froze in Finnish forests in December 1939, that built fires visible from 2 kilometers and could not dig defensive positions in frozen ground, has been replaced by an army that will take Berlin 18 months later. Finland is about to encounter that army at the full height of its operational capability. The Soviet offensive plan for the summer of 1944, as it applies to Finland, is designated Operation Vyborg-Petrozavodsk. It calls for a massive strike on the Karelian Isthmus by the Leningrad Front, commanded by General Leonid Govorov, supported by the 13th Air Army and the Baltic Fleet. The assault force assembled for the Isthmus sector alone numbers approximately 450,000 men, supported by over 10,000 artillery pieces, approximately 800 tanks and self-propelled guns, and over 1,000 aircraft. This is the force that will strike a Finnish defensive line, held by approximately 70,000 men in the main contact area, supported by roughly 100 tanks and 300 aircraft for the entire Finnish Air Force. The disparity in material is not marginal. It is of the kind that, in conventional military analysis, does not admit of a defensive outcome. Govorov has planned the artillery preparation with the meticulous precision that the Soviet artillery arm has developed into one of the most effective practices of the entire war. The offensive will begin with a bombardment of a density that the Karelian Isthmus has never seen and that the Finnish defensive positions are not built to survive. June 9th, 1944. The bombardment begins at 0500. The Finnish defenders in the forward positions on the isthmus experience something that the accounts consistently describe with the same vocabulary. Not a bombardment, but a physical transformation of the environment. The ground moves, the air pressure changes. Men in bunkers that have stood through 4 years of intermittent shelling find those bunkers collapsing around them. Communications are cut within minutes. Telephone lines severed, radio sets damaged, the runners who carry messages between positions either dead or unable to move through the wall of fire. Units that have been in position for months, that know every fold of their ground, find themselves in a landscape that has been altered, trenches half filled with debris, firing positions open to the sky, fields of fire now crossed by craters and fallen timber. In the first 4 hours of the bombardment, the Finnish VT line, the main defensive position on the isthmus, absorbs more artillery fire than it had in the preceding 3 years of the war combined. Then the Soviet infantry and armor advance. The Finnish positions on the VT line break. This is not a failure of courage or of competence. It is the predictable result of a material equation that does not allow for another outcome. Soviet assault units move through gaps in the Finnish line that the bombardment has created, bypassing strong points that are still holding and pushing into the Finnish rear, disrupting communications and the ability of the Finnish command to respond coherently. The Finnish 10th Division, which holds the central sector of the VT line, fights with the ferocity that has characterized Finnish defense since the Winter War, but it fights outnumbered, outgunned, and in positions that have been physically destroyed. By the evening of June 9th, Soviet forces have penetrated the VT line in several sectors. By June 10th, the penetrations have deepened into breakthroughs. By June 11th, Finnish Corps Command acknowledges that the VT line cannot be restored and orders a fighting withdrawal to the next defensive position, the VKT line, some 30 kilometers to the north. The withdrawal is itself a significant achievement, executed under pressure that breaks most armies at this stage of an offensive. Finnish units move by night through terrain they know, maintaining unit cohesion, bringing their wounded and most of their equipment, keeping their flanks covered and their communications functioning. The Soviet pursuit is aggressive. Govorov's plan calls for continuous pressure that gives the Finns no time to consolidate. And the rearguard fighting is severe. Individual Finnish officers make decisions in the hours of this withdrawal that preserve the defensive capacity that will eventually stop the offensive. Companies that hold junction points for just long enough for neighboring units to pass through. Battalions that counterattack local Soviet advances, not to restore positions, but to create the delays that allow the larger withdrawal to complete. This is mobile defensive warfare of a kind that requires a high standard of junior leadership, and the Finnish army in the summer of 1944, after 4 years of continuous war, has that standard throughout its officer corps. General Leonard Oesch, commanding Finnish forces on the Karelian Isthmus, is 52 years old, a career officer who has commanded at every level of the Finnish military. He is, by the assessments of officers who served under him, a man of exceptional composure under pressure. Not the composure of someone who does not understand the situation, but the composure of someone who understands it exactly and has decided that panic is not a useful response to it. Oesch's task in the days following June 9th is to conduct a fighting withdrawal across 40 kilometers of contested terrain while simultaneously constructing a coherent defense of the VKT line with units that have just been in continuous combat for 72 hours. He does this by making the decisions that good defensive commanders make, identifying the critical ground that must be held, assigning the best available units to hold it, positioning his limited armor where it can influence multiple potential breakthrough points, and maintaining the tempo of communications that allows him to redirect reserves from quiet sectors to threatened ones before the threats become irreversible. Field Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim, Commander-in-Chief of the Finnish Defence Forces, is 77 years old in June 1944. He has commanded Finnish forces since 1939, through the Winter War and now through 3 years of the Continuation War, and he carries a weight of institutional knowledge and strategic judgment that no other person in Finland possesses. Mannerheim understands, from the first days of the Soviet offensive, that what is happening on the Karelian Isthmus is not a limited operation designed to exert pressure on the Finnish negotiating position. It is an operation designed to eliminate Finnish military resistance. The objective is not territory. The objective is Finland. He communicates this assessment to the Finnish government with his customary directness and without the reassuring qualifications that governments under pressure sometimes prefer from their military commanders. The situation is critical. The VKT line must hold. If it does not hold, the options available to Finland narrow to two: a military defeat that will allow the Soviet Union to dictate peace terms without negotiation, or a negotiated withdrawal from the war at whatever terms can be extracted while the Finnish army is still in the field. Mannerheim chooses to fight for the line. The VKT line runs from Viipuri on the Gulf of Finland coast east to Kuopio on the western shore of Lake Ladoga, a distance of approximately 100 kilometers. It is a better prepared defensive position than the VT line that has just been broken. Deeper, with more concrete emplacements, better fields of fire, more extensive obstacle systems, but it has been constructed under the resource constraints of a nation fighting a war it did not expect to still be fighting in 1944, and its capacity to absorb the kind of offensive that Govorov is mounting is uncertain. The critical point on the entire line, the place that every Finnish and Soviet officer examining the ground identifies as decisive, is Tali, a road junction in the center of the isthmus through which the main Soviet axis of advance must pass. Behind Tali lies Ihantala, and behind Ihantala the approaches to Viipuri, and behind Viipuri the open ground that leads to the Finnish heartland. If Tali falls and is not recovered, the VKT line is ruptured at its most critical point, and the defensive framework collapses. The Battle of Tali-Ihantala, which runs from late June through mid-July 1944, is the largest battle ever fought on Finnish soil and, by most measures, the most consequential. It involves, on the Finnish side, eventually the greater part of the Finnish army's mobile reserves, concentrated in a sector of approximately 20 kilometers at the maximum point of effort. It involves the entire available Finnish artillery, coordinated in a fire support system that the Finnish army has been refining since the Winter War and that by 1944 represents one of the most effective pieces of military organization Finland possesses. It involves the Armored Division, Finland's only significant armored formation, equipped with a mixture of captured Soviet T-34 tanks and German Sturmgeschütz assault guns, used as a mobile counter-attack force to seal breakthrough points before they can be exploited. And it involves, on the individual level, Finnish infantrymen fighting in positions they have been ordered to hold, and holding them against assault ratios that make the command seem, in the moment of the assault, impossible to execute. The Soviet pressure on Tali-Ihantala through the last days of June is continuous and, at several points, nearly successful. On June 25th, Soviet armor penetrates the Finnish position at Tali and reaches a point from which, if exploitation continues, the VKT line will be irreparably broken. The Finnish response is immediate and violent. The armored division counterattacks, supported by anti-tank guns and infantry who have been positioned in depth precisely for this moment, and the Soviet armor is stopped, then forced back, then the penetration is sealed. The fighting at this junction point alone involves a commitment of Finnish resources that leaves other sectors of the VKT line thinly held and entirely dependent on the Finnish artillery's ability to compensate for infantry weakness. That artillery, firing at rates that consume ammunition at a pace the Finnish supply system is barely able to sustain, fires in the Battle of Tali-Ihantala more rounds in 3 weeks than Finland fired in the entire Winter War. Every gun is registered, every fire mission is coordinated through a system that has been built over years of war and that, under the pressure of the Soviet offensive, performs at a level that Finnish artillery officers would later describe as the finest institutional achievement of the Finnish army in the entire conflict. General Paavo Talvela commands Finnish forces in the northern sector, in Ladoga, Karelia, and the wilderness fronts, where Soviet forces simultaneously press against the Finnish position in operations coordinated with the Isthmus offensive. Talvela is 54 years old, known within the Finnish officer corps for a tactical judgment that borders on clairvoyance. He has commanded in the Winter War, in the early continuation war advances, and through the long static years, and he understands the character of Finnish defensive warfare in forest terrain with a precision that comes from having executed it under fire. On the Ladoga front, the Soviet offensive opens on June 21st, 12 days after the Isthmus attack. Govorov's operational plan sequences the attacks to prevent Finnish reserves from moving freely between fronts, and it strikes at a Finnish position already depleted by the transfer of units to reinforce the Isthmus. Talvela's response is to do what Finnish commanders have done since the Winter War. Accept the breakthrough where it cannot be prevented, concentrate on the critical ground, counter-attack not to restore lost positions, but to create the tactical chaos in the Soviet rear that slows the advance and buys time. The Northern Front bends. It does not break. The Finnish Air Force, flying in the summer of 1944 against a Soviet air arm overwhelmingly superior in numbers, performs a function in this battle that goes beyond what the numbers suggest it should be capable of. By concentrating on close air support in the critical sectors, by using the flexibility of a small force to mass at points where it can influence the ground battle rather than attempting to contest the air comprehensively, and by accepting losses that, relative to its size, are very high, the Finnish Air Force provides the Finnish ground forces with a degree of air support that materially influences the outcome at Tali-Ihantala on several occasions. On July 1st, Finnish aircraft intervene in a Soviet armoured concentration near Ihantala that is preparing to resume the assault, disrupting the preparation sufficiently to reduce the momentum of the subsequent attack. These are not glamorous victories. They are the victories of a small force doing more than it should be able to do in the service of a defensive position that is holding by narrower margins than any external observer would consider sustainable. The Soviet offensive on the Karelian Isthmus begins to lose momentum in mid-July 1944. The Finnish defensive position, which should have broken at Tali, has not broken. The Soviet assault units, in continuous contact since June 9th, are accumulating the attrition of sustained offensive operations in terrain that favors the defender. Soviet logistical requirements are beginning to strain the road network on the Isthmus, and Govorov, who is a careful and competent commander, is reading the ground correctly. The window for a decisive breakthrough is closing. The reserves needed to exploit a breakthrough are being committed elsewhere, because the summer of 1944 is also the summer of Operation Bagration on the Central Eastern Front, the largest Soviet offensive of the entire war, which is consuming everything that can be directed toward it. Finland is important. It is not more important than destroying Army Group Center. The resources are finite and they are going where the decisive result is most obtainable. The Isthmus offensive is reduced in scale. By late July 1944, the Battle of Tali-Ihantala is effectively over, with the Finnish defensive line intact and the Soviet offensive exhausted. The Finnish losses in the battle are severe. Historians estimate approximately 17,000 killed, wounded and missing in the Isthmus sector alone over 6 weeks, representing a fraction of the Finnish army that, relative to the size of the force, is almost unbearable. Soviet losses are estimated by most sources at between 200,000 and 300,000 men across all Finnish fronts in the summer offensive, though the Soviet archival record on this question remains contested. The ground at Tali-Ihantala is, by the end of the fighting, a landscape of the kind that intense modern combat produces. The forest destroyed, the road junctions cratered, the fields of fire permanently altered, the birch groves reduced to splintered trunks. It does not look like a victory. It looks like a place where something terrible happened and then stopped. That it stopped is the victory. The armistice that Finland signs with the Soviet Union in September 1944 requires significant concessions: territory, reparations, the expulsion of German forces from Finnish soil that will lead to the Lapland War. Finland does not achieve the territorial restoration it sought in the Continuation War. What Finland achieves, and what the summer of 1944 makes possible, is the negotiated peace of a nation that is still in the field with its army intact, rather than the dictated terms of a military defeat. The distinction is not academic. The nations that the Soviet Union defeated outright in 1944, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, became Soviet satellite states. Finland, which fought to a standstill and negotiated from a position of demonstrated military viability, remained independent. The Soviet Union's terms for Finland were hard. They were not the terms of a victor dealing with a prostrate enemy. They were the terms negotiated with a country that had just demonstrated at Tali-Ihantala and on the Ladoga front and in the northern wilderness that conquering it was going to cost more than the strategic benefit justified. Mannerheim becomes president of Finland in August 1944, stepping from military command to political leadership at the moment when Finland's diplomatic situation requires the authority that only his name and record can provide. He negotiates the armistice in September. He manages the expulsion of German forces in the Lapland War that follows. He resigns the presidency in 1946, his health broken by the war years. He dies in 1951 in a Swiss clinic, 83 years old, having outlasted the war and its aftermath. The Finnish nation he helped preserve buries him with the honors appropriate to the man who commanded its defense in its two defining modern conflicts, and who found, in the summer of 1944, a way to hold a line that no military calculation said could be held. The soldiers who fought at Tali-Ihantala are not famous outside Finland. The battle does not appear in most general histories of the Second World War. It does not have the profile of Stalingrad or Monte Cassino or the Normandy beaches. It is a Finnish battle fought in Finnish terrain by Finnish men whose names do not translate easily into the dominant narratives of the conflict. But what it accomplished, the survival of Finnish independence at the precise moment when that independence was most threatened, is an outcome that shaped the subsequent history of Northern Europe in ways that have not diminished with time. Finland remained Finland. The Isthmus, the strip of granite and birch forest between Ladoga and the Gulf, held in the summer of 1944, and holding it was sufficient. The impossible proved, as it sometimes does when enough people refuse to accept its impossibility, to be merely very difficult. The Armoured Division, designated the 1st Armoured Division under Major General Ruben Lagos, is the instrument Finland uses to seal each breakthrough at Tali-Ihantala, and Lagos himself is one of the most capable armoured commanders produced by any of the smaller European armies in the Second World War. He is 45 years old in the summer of 1944, compact and precise in his manner, and he has been building the Armoured Division from the early years of the Continuation War, with a focus on combined arms coordination that the German advisors who observed Finnish training repeatedly commended. The division's equipment is a hybrid that reflects Finland's particular position in the war. German Sturmgeschütz III. Assault guns acquired through the co-belligerent relationship, captured Soviet T-34s taken in the advances of 1941 and repaired and pressed into Finnish service, and a variety of other vehicles assembled from whatever sources were available. It is not a first-class armoured formation by German or Soviet standards. It is a formation that Lagos has trained and drilled and led to a level of effectiveness that exceeds what its equipment would predict. At Tali, he commits it at the moment of maximum Soviet penetration, accepting the tactical risk of a counterattack with limited forces into a prepared Soviet defensive position, because the alternative, allowing the penetration to deepen for another hour, is worse. The counterattack succeeds. The Soviet armor is stopped. The line holds at Tali for another 24 hours, and then another, and then the momentum shifts. The German supply of anti-tank weapons to Finland in June and July 1944 is a factor that some historians have credited with decisive importance, and others have assessed more cautiously. What is certain is that Germany, recognizing the strategic value of a Finland that is still fighting and tying down Soviet forces that might otherwise be directed at the Eastern Front, expedites the delivery of Panzerfaust disposable anti-tank weapons and Panzerschreck recoilless launchers in quantities that arrive in the first weeks of the Soviet offensive. These weapons, in the hands of Finnish infantry who have been trained to use them and who are defending ground they know intimately, provide a close-range anti-tank capability that materially increases the cost of Soviet armored advances through the forest terrain of the isthmus. A Soviet T-34 that can be destroyed by a single Finnish soldier with a Panzerfaust at 50 meters range in a forest position represents a very different calculation for Soviet tank commanders than the same T-34 on open ground against infantry with conventional weapons. The forest on the Karelian Isthmus favors exactly the kind of close-range ambush for which the new weapons are designed, and the Finnish infantry uses them with a methodical efficiency that is consistent with everything that Finnish defensive warfare in this terrain has always produced. The intelligence dimension of the 1944 battles is less dramatic than the ultra story of the Scharnhorst, but no less important to the outcome. Finnish signals intelligence, which has been reading Soviet radio traffic since the Winter War and has developed considerable sophistication over 4 years of static front operations, provides Finnish commanders with advance warning of several of the major Soviet attacks on the VKT line that allows reserves to be repositioned before the attack opens rather than after. The specific accuracy of this intelligence varies, and Finnish commanders are appropriately cautious about acting on signals intelligence that might be deception. But on several critical occasions, the warning is sufficiently precise and sufficiently timely that Finnish forces are in position to meet Soviet attacks at their point of concentration, rather than reacting to breakthroughs after they occur. This is not a decisive intelligence advantage of the kind that shaped the North Cape battle. It is a marginal advantage, one that improves the odds in a situation where the odds are already very bad. And marginal advantages matter enormously in battles where the margin between holding and breaking is as narrow as it is at Tali-Ihantala in late June and early July 1944. The experience of the individual Finnish soldier at Tali-Ihantala is documented in a range of accounts, memoirs, unit histories, oral testimonies collected by Finnish military historians in the decades after the war, that collectively describe a battle of a particular quality that is different from the Winter War and different from the years of static front and different from anything the Finnish army had experienced before. The Winter War was intense but short, a crisis that lasted 105 days and then ended. The continuation war static years were grinding and psychologically exhausting, but not operationally intense in the way that active combat is intense. Tali-Ihantala is both. Operationally intense and sustained over weeks, with the additional psychological weight of knowing that the outcome of this battle determines whether Finland survives. Finnish veterans who fought at Tali-Ihantala and who gave accounts to historians in later decades consistently describe the battle in terms that emphasize this weight. Not just the fighting, they had been fighting for years, but the specific awareness that this time the fighting mattered in a way it had not mattered since the Winter War, that what happened here was final in a sense that the previous years had not been final. Private Imo Korhonen, a rifleman with the 4th Infantry Division who fought at the center of the Tali defensive sector in late June 1944, gave a detailed account to a Finnish oral history project in 1977. He was 22 years old during the battle, a carpenter's son from Tampere who had been in the army since 1942 and who had spent the continuation war years on the quiet sectors of the static front north of Ladoga before being transferred south in June as part of the reinforcement of the isthmus. He describes the experience of arriving at a battle already in progress, the sight of Finnish units withdrawing past his position, the sound of artillery heavier than anything he had heard in 2 years of service, the specific sensory quality of the Karelian Isthmus in late June, when the birch trees are in full leaf and the light at midnight is still a deep twilight, and the landscape has a beauty that is incongruous with what is happening in it. He describes the order to hold his company's position with a simplicity that removes any drama from the instruction. They were told to hold, and they held, and the Soviets came, and they fired, and the Soviets came again, and they fired again, and this continued for several days until the position was rotated out for rest. He does not describe heroism in the language of heroism. He describes work, difficult and sustained and physically and psychologically exhausting work, done by men who had learned how to do it over years of training and experience, and who applied that knowledge in a situation that exceeded what any of them had expected to face. The line held, he says, because the men on it were not willing to leave it. That is not a complicated explanation. It is the accurate one. The weeks of fighting between late June and mid-July 1944 at Tali-Ihantala produce a landscape that Finnish survivors and later visitors have described with a consistency that suggests the scene made an impression that did not fade. The birch forest that covers the Karelian Isthmus in normal circumstances is one of the characteristic landscapes of Northern Europe. White-barked trees, dappled light, the particular quality of air in a northern forest in summer. By mid-July 1944, the forest at Tali has been replaced by something different. The bombardment has stripped leaves from surviving trees, broken trunks at mid-height, churned the soil into a surface of craters and debris. The ground holds the evidence of what has passed over it. Shell casings, ammunition boxes, discarded equipment, the specific detritus of modern warfare concentrated in a small area over several weeks. The Finnish soldiers who moved through this ground in the final weeks of the battle are moving through a landscape that their own fire and the Soviet fire together have destroyed, and they are moving through it to man positions in what remains of the defensive line. They do it without apparent awareness of the incongruity. They do it because it is the ground they have been assigned to defend, and defending it is what they came here to do. The strategic picture in which the Battle of Tali-Ihantala is embedded is larger than the battle itself, and understanding it requires attention to what is happening elsewhere in the summer of 1944. Operation Bagration, the Soviet offensive against Army Group Center on the Central Eastern Front, opens on June 23, 1944, 2 weeks after the Finnish offensive begins, and at a scale that dwarfs every other offensive operation of the summer. In a month of fighting, Bagration destroys Army Group Center. 28 of 34 divisions are shattered or destroyed. The Germans suffer the worst defeat in their military history, and the front line moves 300 kilometers westward. Bagration consumes Soviet resources on a scale that the Finland operation cannot compete with, and from late June onward, the allocation of Soviet military assets is governed primarily by the requirements of Bagration. This does not mean that Finland is saved by Bagration. The Finnish army saves Finland at Tali-Ihantala and on the Ladoga front by fighting effectively in a situation of material disadvantage. But Bagration's resource demands set a ceiling on Soviet commitment to the Finland front. That means the Finnish defensive position, once it proves viable, will not be overwhelmed by unlimited escalation. Govorov must work with what he has. What he has by mid-July is not enough to break a Finnish defensive line that has been held at the cost of 17,000 Finnish casualties and has demonstrated that it is not going to be broken. Finland's post-war history is, in significant part, the history of what the summer of 1944 made possible. The Finno-Soviet armistice of September 1944 and the subsequent Paris Peace Treaty of 1947 imposed significant obligations on Finland. Substantial territorial cessions, large war reparations paid in industrial goods over several years, restrictions on the size and character of the Finnish military, and the political obligation of maintaining cordial relations with a Soviet neighbor that will remain in place for the next 50 years. These are not the terms of a victorious nation. They are the terms of a nation that survived. That distinction matters because the alternative, the terms that would have been imposed on a Finland that had been militarily defeated in the summer of 1944, was not the terms of the Paris Peace Treaty. It was the terms that were imposed on Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in 1940, which were incorporated entirely into the Soviet Union and ceased to exist as independent states for the next 50 years. Finland's survival as an independent nation and the specific character of the terms on which it survived depends on the outcome at Tali-Ihantala in a direct and traceable way. The battle bought Finland the right to negotiate rather than simply to accept whatever was offered. In the specific political context of 1944, that right was the difference between independence and absorption. The continuation war that precedes the summer crisis of 1944 is itself a story of strategic complexity that Finnish historians have debated since the armistice, and that debate is essential background to understanding what the summer of 1944 means. Finland's decision to enter the war alongside Germany in June 1941 was not, Finnish leaders insisted at the time, and Finnish historians have largely maintained since, a decision to align with National Socialism or to participate in the German ideological project. It was a decision rooted in the specific experience of the Winter War, the loss of territory, the demonstrated hostility of the Soviet Union toward Finnish independence, and the calculation that a German attack on the Soviet Union offered Finland the opportunity to recover what the Moscow Peace Treaty had taken. The calculation was not unreasonable, given the information available to Finnish decision-makers in June 1941. Germany appeared to be winning decisively. The Soviet Union appeared to be in serious difficulties. The window for Finnish military action seemed clear. What Finnish leaders did not, could not, know in June 1941 was that Germany would not win the war, that the Soviet Union would recover and ultimately prevail, and that Finland would eventually have to negotiate a peace with a victorious Soviet Union that remembered very clearly which side of the German campaign Finland had chosen to stand on. This context bears directly on the summer of 1944, because it means that when Govorov's offensive opens on June 9th, Finland is fighting for something more than territory. It is fighting for the right to continue to exist as a state that makes its own decisions. A Soviet Union that defeats Finland militarily in 1944 has options that range from the imposition of a compliant government to outright annexation, and Finnish leaders are under no illusion about which direction Soviet policy might move. Mannerheim understands this with the clarity that 77 years of experience in the collision zone of Finnish and Russian history provides. The fight for the VKT line is, in the literal sense of the term, a fight for the country. Not for a government, not for a political system, not for a leader, for the country itself, the specific piece of Northern Europe that is Finland, with its language and its culture and its particular ways of understanding itself and its relationship to the landscape it inhabits. The Finnish soldiers who fight at Tali-Ihantala fight within this context, whether or not they articulate it in those terms. Most of them do not articulate it. They articulate it in simpler terms. This is our ground. These are our positions. This is where we stop them. The simplicity is not shallow. It is the distillation of something that goes deeper than strategic analysis. It is the territorial instinct that every army fighting on home soil shares. The specific quality of motivation that comes from defending not an abstract principle, but a specific place, a specific piece of earth that belongs to the people who are fighting for it in a way that it does not belong to the people attacking it. Finnish soldiers in the continuation war had, for 3 years, been fighting at varying distances from home, at the pre-Winter War borders, in some sectors beyond them, in terrain that was Finnish but not always familiar. At Tali-Ihantala. In the summer of 1944, the terrain is very close to the border of the country's inhabited heartland, and the soldiers defending it are defending ground that their families live near and that their culture has claimed and that their army has been guarding for years. This is the ground behind which there is no more ground to give. The Finnish artillery system that performs so decisively at Tali-Ihantala has a history that goes back to the Winter War, and that represents, in its 1944 form, the accumulated institutional learning of 4 years of continuous combat. Finnish artillery in the Winter War was adequate but not modern, and the Winter War's lessons about what concentrated Soviet infantry and armour required in the way of defensive fire support were learned at considerable cost. In the Continuation War years, the Finnish Artillery Corps invested in the development of a fire control and coordination system that by 1944 allows Finnish guns to be massed in support of threatened sectors more rapidly and more precisely than almost any comparable system in the armies of the smaller European powers. The key innovation is organizational rather than technical. A system of fire direction centers that can aggregate the fires of multiple artillery units across unit boundaries, applying the guns of one division to the support of another division's threatened sector, without the command friction that normally makes such cross-boundary fire support slow and imprecise. At Tali-Ihantala, this system allows Finnish artillery to concentrate fires in support of the armoured division's counter-attacks with a speed and precision that Soviet forces do not anticipate, and that materially affects the outcome of several critical moments in the battle. The guns are not especially modern. The system that directs them is. The Karelian Isthmus of 1944 is also a landscape shaped by 4 years of Finnish defensive preparation, and that preparation, the bunkers, the obstacle systems, the prepared firing positions, the roads and trails improved for military movement, provides the Finnish defenders with a physical environment that partially compensates for their numerical inferiority. A defensive position that has been occupied for years by the same units, that has been improved continually through those years, and that is defended by men who have spent that time learning its every feature, is a position of considerably greater value than its physical dimensions suggest. Finnish soldiers at Tali-Ihantala in June and July 1944 are fighting in positions that many of them helped build, over terrain that they have patrolled and studied and incorporated into their tactical thinking for months or years. They know where the natural defiles are that channel Soviet armour. They know which ridgelines provide observation over the likely Soviet axes of advance. They know which sectors of the front can be thinned to provide reserves for threatened points without creating gaps that Soviet infantry can exploit. This knowledge, accumulated over years of static front and given physical form in the defensive preparation of the position, is a form of military capital that does not appear in any order of battle, but that is present in every tactical engagement of the summer 1944 battles. The international dimension of Finland's 1944 crisis is rarely foregrounded in accounts of the Tali-Ihantala battle, but it shapes the political framework within which the military events occur. The United States and Britain, while formally at peace with Finland, both had declined to declare war despite Soviet pressure, are increasingly concerned about Finland's position as a German co-belligerent, and have been conducting quiet diplomatic efforts to encourage Finland to exit the war. American diplomatic communications to Helsinki in the spring and summer of 1944 makes clear that the United States is not indifferent to Finland's fate, and that a negotiated Finnish exit from the war would be viewed favorably in Washington. These diplomatic signals do not affect the military situation directly, but they affect the political calculation of Finnish leaders as they negotiate both the continuation of the war and the eventual armistice. Finland is not entirely without diplomatic cards, and the knowledge that the United States and Britain prefer Finnish independence to Finnish absorption is a card that Mannerheim plays carefully in the armistice negotiations with the Soviet Union in August and September 1944. The German dimension of Finland's 1944 crisis is equally complex. Germany, recognizing that Finnish capitulation would expose the German position in Norway and northern Finland to pressure from the east, has a strong interest in keeping Finland in the war, and has been supplying Finland with weapons and materiel under the co-belligerent arrangement throughout the Continuation War. When the Soviet offensive opens in June 1944, Germany accelerates deliveries of anti-tank weapons and aircraft fuel and spare parts that Finnish forces need for the defense. The Sturm Infantry Division Norwegian, a German division stationed in Finland as part of the co-belligerent arrangement, is not committed to the Karelian Isthmus battle, but its presence in northern Finland represents a reserve that the Finnish command knows exists. Hitler's personal intervention, he dispatches Foreign Minister Ribbentrop to Helsinki on June 22nd to demand a formal Finnish declaration that Finland will not seek a separate peace, is a reminder of how much Germany needs Finland to continue fighting, and Mannerheim's response to Ribbentrop's demands, measured, non-committal, refusing to give Germany the formal pledge it seeks, while not breaking the co-belligerent relationship, is a diplomatic achievement that preserves Finnish options without triggering a German rupture that would eliminate German supply deliveries at the critical moment of the defensive battle. It is one of the more remarkable diplomatic performances of the summer of 1944, conducted by a 77-year-old field marshal simultaneously managing a defensive battle for national survival. Finland's survival in the summer of 1944 is the product of all these elements simultaneously. The military performance of the Finnish army at Tali-Ihantala and on the northern fronts, the diplomatic skill of Finnish leaders in managing German pressure and Soviet demands, the fortuitous timing of Operation Bagration, which limited Soviet resources available for the Finnish front, and the accumulated institutional learning of 4 years of continuous war that gave the Finnish military the specific capabilities it needed for this specific crisis. None of these elements is sufficient on its own. Together, they produce an outcome that every rational analysis of the situation in early June 1944 would have said was not available. The men who died at Tali-Ihantala, Finnish and Soviet alike, died in a battle whose outcome was not certain until it was over, and whose significance was not fully understood until the armistice and its terms revealed what the battle had purchased. The Finnish dead at Tali-Ihantala are buried in military cemeteries on the isthmus, in ground that is now Finnish rather than Soviet because of what those men and their living comrades did in 6 weeks of fighting in the summer of 1944. The Soviet dead are buried in mass graves that were later consolidated and marked in what is now Russian territory, in the region that became part of the Soviet Union under the armistice terms. The battlefield itself, Tali-Ihantala, the road junctions and forest positions and granite ridges where the decisive fighting occurred, passed to the Soviet Union under the armistice and has been Russian territory since. The Finnish soldiers who fought there fought for ground they did not get to keep. They fought for something more important than the ground itself, which was the right of the country behind the ground to exist on its own terms. That right they secured. The ground was the price. The legacy of 1944 lives in Finland, not as a celebration of war, but as a reckoning with what defense of independence actually costs. The Finnish word for it is talvisota and jatkosota, the Winter War and the Continuation War, and Finns of the generation that fought them carried those words with a weight that subsequent generations have spent decades trying to understand and properly honor. The cemeteries on the Karelian Isthmus, visited each year by Finnish families making the journey into what is now Russian territory to find the graves of men who held the line there, are the most concrete expression of that reckoning. Stones in the ground of a country that is no longer Finland, marking the place where men fought for a Finland that survived precisely because they did not leave those positions when leaving would have been the rational thing to do. The price was paid. The country endured. What makes the Tali-Ihantala story particularly resistant to simple narration is that it does not resolve into the clean arc of victory that most military histories prefer. Finland wins the battle and loses the ground. The soldiers fight brilliantly and the country survives and the territory is ceded anyway. The men who held the VKT line at the cost of 17,000 casualties are honored in a country that no longer controls the land on which they fell. There is no monument at Tali that Finns can visit without crossing an international border. The battle is decisive in its consequence and invisible in its geography, and that combination of enormous historical significance and complete physical absence from the Finnish landscape gives the summer of 1944 a particular quality in Finnish national memory, present everywhere in the consciousness of those who know the history, visible nowhere in the terrain. The ground was given back. The country was not. If this story hit you, like and subscribe. We find these forgotten stories every single day. Here is the question that lingers. Finland survived 1944, not because it defeated the Soviet Union, it did not, but because it made the cost of defeating it high enough that the Soviet Union chose negotiation over total victory. And watch this next video. See you there.